In the last section, we took a look at the myName function right here, and we had said that we were going to start to talk about types inside of Dart. So in this section, we're going to get an overview of the type system in Dart, and we're going to kind of clarify a couple things about it. So let's get to it. I've got a couple of rules right here listed on the screen. So these are a couple of items that we're going to go over that's going to help clarify how types work inside of Dart. Before we go over these items, I want to just mention very quickly that if you've never worked with a strongly typed language before, so if you come from a background like, say, JavaScript or Ruby, and you feel like types are generally a little bit intimidating or confusing, I really recommend you not get too worried about it. Dart's type system is very approachable and relatively pretty straightforward to get used to. So with that in mind, let's start looking at these items. So every single value that we declare inside of a Dart program has a type associated with it. Likewise, every variable that we declare has a type that it can reference. Now these two slides right here are already getting a little bit tricky and kind of interesting. So we just said every value has a type and every variable has a type. So what's the difference between a variable and a value? Well, I want you to consider one of the lines of code that we were just looking at. And we're going to break this down piece by piece and figure out what the difference between a value and a reference is. Okay, so we're going to look at this line right here. Remember, we say var name, which declares our variable, and then on the right-hand side, we call the myName function. When we call myName, we return the string Stephen right here. So essentially, you and I can kind of imagine that this line of code right here kind of is equivalent to this, right? Not terribly different, at least somewhat similar. So let's just kind of make that assumption for just a second and take a look at a diagram that's going to help us understand the difference between a value and a variable. So that whenever that line of code runs, this is what's really going on inside of your computer's memory. The code to the left-hand side of the equals, where we do that variable declaration, creates a new space inside of your computer's memory that holds that name variable. The name variable has the ability to reference another value that is stored inside of your computer's memory. Then the right-hand side of the equal sign, so the myName over here, where we return the string of Stephen, creates what is known as a value inside of memory as well. So when that entire line of code executes, we end up with a variable or a reference over here on the left-hand side and a value over here on the right-hand side. The value has a type of string associated with it. So this over here, it is of type string. So that's why we say that every value has a type associated with it. But likewise, that thing on the left, the thing that is referencing that value, can have a type associated with it as well. So because this name variable over here is pointing at a value with type string, that implicitly means that the name variable can only reference other values of type string. So what I mean by that is that after we have made that association right there between name and string right here, if I then created another value inside of my application, like say the integer 123, I could not have this name variable over here reference that integer, because this name variable has already been associated with type string. Now looking at this in diagram format and giving you a verbal description might be a little bit confusing, so let me give you a little bit more practical example back over inside of Dartpad. When you and I just declared that variable right here of name and then assigned a string to it, that means that name can only reference a string. So if I then try to assign the value of, say, name equals 123, like so, I'm going to end up seeing an error message that says, hey, you're trying to assign a value of type int to a variable of type string. So again, when we start thinking about types inside of Dart, there is a difference between values and references. And we always want to be aware of the differences between the two. Okay, let's go continue down this list right here. So we just spoke about the third item right here. Once a variable has a type associated with it, as we're doing back on that line of code over in Dartpad right now, we cannot change the type of value that that variable can reference. So once we say my name right here has string type associated with it, we can not say, oh, well now I want name to instead store a integer instead. Now the last rule that we're going to talk about is that this is where Dart's type system is very approachable if you've never worked with static typing before. Dart can often guess the type of a given variable for us. And so we do not always have to specifically annotate the type of a variable. Let me show you a very practical example of this. So back over inside of our code over here, I want you to click on the variable name up here at the top left-hand side. When we do so, you'll notice that the bottom right panel down here says that the variable name is of type string. So Dart is clever enough to see that our myName function right here returns a value of type string. And we take that value of type string and assign it to the name variable. So Dart has enough information by looking at your program to infer or kind of guess that name is supposed to reference a value of type string. That's kind of the purpose of putting the string keyword down right here. By annotating the return type of this function, Dart has a little bit more information about what's going on inside of our program and can do a better job of guessing the different types that are flowing around it. Now, one thing I want to mention is that we do not necessarily have to always annotate every single type inside of our program. So, for example, if we wanted to, we could have dropped off this entire string annotation right here. Now, you'll notice that I do not have any errors in my code, like nothing is turning red, and if I click on Run up here, my code still runs appropriately. However, Dart no longer has enough information to actually guess about the type of the variable name right here. And if you click on it, you'll notice that now the type is labeled as dynamic. When you see a type of dynamic, that means that Dart is essentially saying, you know what, I don't really know what type this variable is. I'm going to label it as a catch-all type, which is the dynamic type. The dynamic type essentially means that Dart just doesn't really know what type this variable is. And so only by having you and I as developers annotate some specific functions or specific variables inside of our application do we give Dart just enough information to figure out exactly what's going on. So if I add string back on here as a type annotation to the myName function and click on myName or named again up here, Dart again has enough information to figure out what type that variable should be. Okay, so in this section, we spoke about a couple of confusing rules about types inside of Dart. First off, remember every value has a type, and every variable has a type that it can reference. Once a variable has a type associated with it, we cannot magically change that type at some point in the future. And then finally, you and I, as developers, can optionally annotate the types of functions or variables to give Dart a little bit more information about what value types are flowing around our application. At this point, this type stuff might still seem really confusing, but don't sweat it. We're going to be talking about types throughout this course just non-stop, so you'll get a lot of experience with types. And even at the end of the day, if you still feel like types are confusing after this course, the good news is that honestly, to some degree, you can kind of just ignore them. In a lot of programs, you can kind of just drop them off entirely, have no types labeled, and still write a working program. Now, there's definitely downsides to that we'll talk about quite a bit throughout the course, but all I'm trying to say is that if types seem very strange, don't sweat it. It's not the worst thing in the world. Okay, so let's take a pause right here. We're going to come back in the next section.